All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to TME Presents Executing Structural Repairs at Coast Guard Base Miami Beach. You've read the article, now learn the rest of the story. I'm Daniel Wheatley, the Associate Editor for the Military Engineer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before we get started, though, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how best to participate in today's event. All of our attendees are in a listen-only mode for the presentation. You can use the chat pane to chat with your fellow attendees. Let's all try that now. Type in where you're listening from today. For me, I'm up in Virginia at our SME National Office, and it's a beautiful fall day out here. You can submit questions for the presenter at any time by using the questions pane of the control panel. We will collect these and will address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please also submit any technical issues you may be encountering here as well. I see some people, we've got Seattle, we've got Texas here. Thank you all for making it out here. Really appreciate all of you guys coming out here. Originally published in the May-June 2021 issue of TME, Executing Structural Repairs at Coast Guard Base Miami Beach covered the repair of the entrance bridge for Coast Guard Base Miami Beach after signs of settlement were discovered in 2016. Executing a major repair to the bridge faced a host of complications, however. The bridge was only 22 feet wide, and except for brief interruptions, a traffic lane capable of accommodating 10-foot wide vehicular traffic had to be maintained throughout the project. Second, the Coast Guard lacked a real property interest to any laydown, staging, or construction work area at the head of the bridge. Third, construction on a neighboring ferry terminal and parking garage was scheduled to commence in 2019 and continue into 2020. The two major projects would likely be competing for the same laydown and work areas, making coordination between federal and commercial entities imperative. To overcome these challenges, careful construction phasing and coordination with multiple state and private entities was required. I would now like to introduce the author and today's speaker, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Becker, who is currently serving as Facility Engineer for Coast Guard Base Miami Beach. Commissioned from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in 2011, he has completed tours in Alaska, North Carolina, Texas, and Florida. And his civil engineering experience includes time as a regional facilities manager, construction project manager, damage assessment team leader, and facility engineer. Lieutenant Commander Becker is a Texas licensed professional engineer and a licensed Florida attorney. With that, I turn it over to you, Lieutenant Commander Becker, so take it away.
Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate you joining me for the saga that was executing the structural repairs to our roadway bridge here at Base Miami Beach. I am Lieutenant Commander Becker, and with that, I'm going to breeze past our first slide here, which is a reiteration, and move into our topics. So to give a brief overview, I'll start with a brief overview that outlines what Base Miami Beach's footprint is, what kind of our mission set is, some of the things that happen on base, and how critical that bridge is to those operations. I'll get into discussing the bridge settlement, how it was discovered, what we found, roll into the initial action side of the house. How did we keep operations running while a long-term solution was developed? And then the main event is the major repairs. I'll discuss the design and funding, as well as the execution, some of the challenges encountered and how we overcame them, as well as some lessons learned. And I'll close with the current status of the bridge, as well as its future outlook, before I roll it back to Daniel for some question and answer, hopefully answers. Let's see, move on here. Bear with me. All right, so you see here, this is an aerial shot of Coast Guard Base Miami Beach, which is a 11-acre man-made island. It is directly adjacent to what you probably know as Miami Beach from video or movies and TV. It was constructed in the 1940s. It's home to approximately 300 Coast Guard personnel with 2 tenant commands, 7 ships. Access to this facility is made possible via, yes, that one little bridge at the bottom of the picture. That bridge supports a myriad of operations that occur on board Base Miami Beach. We have search and rescue and law enforcement operations that are conducted by the ships and the station boats, as well as kind of general operations coordination that's run by the command center. And we also have boat overhaul and ship main diesel engine swap outs that are executed by the industrial production facility. And those operations often, or not often, occasionally require things as large as like a 30,000 pound main diesel engine to come on and off the base. So the bridge definitely gets, we get our use out of it, and it showed it in this project. So let's move on. Okay, so here you can see an overview of our bridge. The Base Miami Beach entrance bridge is approximately 300 feet long. It is a 1-lane roadway bridge, 22 feet wide. It consists of 11 bents at 32-foot typical spacing. Bent 1 now a little bit longer, or that span 1's a little longer now. Each bent consists of a 30-inch by 30-inch cast-in-place concrete pile cap with 4 18-inch square pre-stressed concrete piles driven to roughly 60 to 70 feet. The deck consists of 8-inch thick, simply supported precast concrete planks, which span between those caps. There are 6 per span. And then the bridge has a maximum allowable wheel load of 16,000 pounds. In the industry, I think you all call that an HS-20 TAC 44. The structure itself, as I've said, built in the 40s, it comes with a pretty extensive repair history. The last 2 decades have seen a $200,000 span 1 deck replacement project that was executed in 2002. There was a $600,000 above water spalling project that was completed in 2015. And then the subject of this webinar was the $2.8 million span 1 reinforcement project that was finally completed in 2020. Let's see if I can better move between. There we go. All right. So the subject of this webinar is the structural reinforcement project. What led to that was the discovery of settlement. So a diligent inspection by a facility engineering department staff member under the leadership of now Lieutenant Commander Stephanie Wood, if she's out there, observed the irregularity depicted in these pictures. So you can see how the bulkhead had separated from the bridge deck itself, a obvious indication that something's not right. As any good engineering department would, they further investigated the problem. And lo and behold, we had some pretty severe cracking at the mid-span of bent 1. You can see the hand there for reference as to how severe the cracking was, fractured at roughly mid-span. Moving on, here we go. So these 2 pictures don't really do it justice, but it was probably where the worst of the settlement was observed. And what you're looking at there is approximately a 3-inch gap that had developed between the bottom half of the decking, or the bottom side of the decking, and the top of the pile cap due to that settlement. So at this point, we had a bearing surface that wasn't lining up with where the weight was actually being distributed. That's a big problem. So load limiting was put in place, and this was sent up the civil engineering chain of command to figure out what the next steps would be. As with any problem that you encounter or failure, extensive conversations are had regarding what on earth happened, how did we get here, how can we prevent it from happening again. So there was kind of a laundry list of thoughts that came out of that. There was a new sheet pile wall that was recently driven with a vibratory hammer in close proximity to the bridge. There was additional truck traffic transiting the bridge during this time period because of a large waterfront rebuild that was occurring on the north side or east side of the island. Maybe a combination of those. In addition, the age of the bridge just kind of lends itself to starting to fail. In the end, a cause was not determined with certainty. However, in the design phase, there were plenty of geotechnical surveys and other things that were commissioned in order to rule out a like failure in the follow-on in the repairs. So I wanted to paint the picture for y'all here. When I say that the piles were driven, or those vibratory driven piles were close to the bridge, I mean right next to it. This is an aerial view of what is now the new Fisher Island ferry terminal. So you can see the ferry dock there. It's actually moored up in this picture. They redid this entire bulkhead to the east, and it included sheet piles almost right up adjacent to the bridge. There was a significant amount of sheet piles that were driven. It wasn't one day's worth. So without a doubt, it was definitely in close proximity, and would actually have some impact on how some of the construction work was done, knowing that we probably had settlement from the vibratory effects of this hammer. Okay, this takes us to to the initial action that was taken. So due to the lead time for securing funding, designing, awarding, and constructing a permanent fix, emergent mitigation steps were needed. As I mentioned, we put load limits in place and then worked with facilities worked with CEU Miami to develop a project to lift the bridge deck up to where it was flush, and then remove the existing neoprene pad, and then inject epoxy grout to level off the load-bearing surface, and additionally more work to repair, to the extent they could, the cracks that were shown in the pile cap. All right, so here are some pictures of the pile repair, or the deck repair mitigation steps in action. These mitigation steps were completed in June of 2017. So it was approximately 6 months after the initial discovery of the settlement. Once these temporary repairs were in place, heavy traffic was allowed to resume use of the bridge. And the facilities engineering department monitored it regularly for signs of settlement. Picture on the left there are those hydraulic jacks in place that actually lifted the deck of the bridge up. And then on the right side, you can see the finished product there, where that bearing surface is much prettier. It's against that decking, and you would actually have that force transmitted to what was left of the pile cap. All right, this brings us to the major repairs. Wanted to give you kind of a timeline and an idea of how all this progressed. It was funded, major repairs were funded in August of 2017, made it through design by March of 2019, was awarded in 2019 to Anderson Place Construction, notice proceed issued by December, and then we were completed approximately 12 months later. Obviously, you see the gap there between funded and design completion. A lot of things had to be worked out. I'll get into those next. Okay, so a lot of design considerations with executing a project like this. And from the end user seat here at Base Miami Beach, I won't say that I had visibility on all this. In fact, I was actually at CU, but in a different department. Regardless, you could do a whole nother webinar on the subject material here with everything that was encountered in trying to get this bridge project just to the contracting phase. That being said, I'll highlight a few things. From a real property standpoint, the Coast Guard lacked a real property interest after the bridge. Once that bridge ends, once that concrete stops, there is no Coast Guard ownership to anything. So the laydown area and staging area was in fact entirely owned by the Florida Department of Transportation. And to further complicate that, half of the area we needed that FDOT owned had been leased to the city of Miami Beach. So real property definitely had their hands full with this one. All three parties, Coast Guard, FDOT, City of Miami Beach, had to come together in one agreement and formalize a temporary use, rights of access and use agreement, as well as a release and hold harmless. Then the construction area where we were actually going to be fixing the bridge was itself on one side, on the south end for phase 2, owned by the Fisher Island Community Association, which required additional separate access and use agreements. And as Daniel mentioned in the introduction, was complicated by their ferry terminal construction that was about to start spinning up. So we also had operational concerns, had to allow for that 10-foot traffic lane. Bridge was only 22 feet wide, so that made it kind of difficult, but that's where the phasing came in. And as with any project, the asbestos and lead-based paint had to be looked at. Surveys were conducted. They were fairly unremarkable, with nothing of concern noted. Now, one of the things that was a big concern, since we had just had an entire bent start to settle, was geotechnical. So to confirm the subsurface conditions hadn't dramatically changed from when the bridge was built, a geotechnical survey was ordered. This explored the subsurface conditions on the site, and 2 standard penetration test borings were performed at the approximate locations shown on the figure to the left. These borings were completed via a barge to 80 feet below the deck. Afterwards, the soil samples were tested for moisture content, grain size distribution, and corrosion properties. The results, somewhat of which you can see the profile on the right there. The survey findings were fairly unremarkable and recommended square precast and pre-stressed concrete piles of at least 18 inches be driven to at least 60 feet. So that checked one box for geotechnical, but we weren't done yet. So South Florida, unsurprisingly, home to numerous species of coral, some of which claim base Miami Beach as their home. We are an island after all. In order to determine what levels of protection or mitigation would be necessary, a benthic survey had to be completed to determine if any corals would be affected by the proposed project. As you can see from the image, more than a few corals were found in the immediate vicinity. This resulted in discussions with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who would ultimately ask for coral relocation or compensatory mitigation. That relocation requirement or mitigation was undoubtedly part of the reason why the design went forward as a replacement of a bent to the west of the existing bent, as opposed to in the water, due to the environmental impact of that follow-on in-water construction. Additionally, regardless of whether or not we built on land or construction was done in the water, debris mitigation strategies had to be used and were used to ensure that runoff or debris falling from the bridge didn't injure the surrounding corals or other aquatic life that are in this area, such as manatees. Okay, so this brings us to major repairs. Bear with me here. I realize that I pole vaulted past the entire design process and the contracting action. Again, we could do a whole nother webinar on that stuff. Appreciate all the efforts that those folks had on this process, but we'll dig into the good stuff. So the design scope and sequence of events for this project were as follows. You'd start by installing a temporary sheet pile wall 3 feet to the west of the new pile placement area. Then the contractor would excavate and install false work. The pile shafts themselves would be pre-drilled, and then new precast concrete piles would be driven adjacent to the settling vent. From that, the cap would be cut, and you would construct a new pile cap form and pour a new cap. The existing deck would then be prepped and removed. A longer deck would be installed and post-tensioned. Then backfill and compaction would occur. And ultimately, you would remove that temporary sheet pile and then mill and pave over everything. There was a couple mill and pave operations during this project. Kind of had to do one for each phase, and then the entire bridge was mill and overlaid in the end. So as with any good project, we ran into a modification right out of the gate. It was noted essentially immediately that the existing 12-inch ductile iron domestic water line and 8-inch sewer line were well past their useful life, and replacing only a small portion of these pipes in order to complete the project would result in duplicitous contracting action and subject the base to additional utility interruptions while increasing the risk for a catastrophic failure and emergency repairs. The most cost-effective course of action was to place the existing 300 feet of replace the existing 300 feet of bridge-mounted piping with new HDPE piping as part of the project while the contractor was mobilized. More to follow on the execution of that aspect, but thank you to the contracting officer for finding in scope, and thank you to the FAMs for finding funding for it. Okay, so now we're actually working on the bridge. So step one, make sure everything's safe, right? Before the major work could be executed, the railings had to be removed and temporary safety railings installed. This bridge was only 22 feet wide, and if we were going to basically cut half of it out, we weren't going to have these foot-wide railings that existed. We needed to maximize our space. In addition, it was going to make it difficult to get the decking out. So in addition to that, the guard shack had to be relocated a safe distance from the construction site. It's essentially right next to the end of the bridge. So that had to be moved while maintaining its control function. The guard shack has the buttons that raise and lower our barricade system. So that had to be maintained. And once all of this was accomplished, phase one was able to proceed. During construction, I'll note that once a phase began, that section was load limited to 20 tons. And then once the new planks were installed and we were able to get traffic onto a newly installed and grouted plank system that had been post-tensioned, the load limiting would be removed and you would be able to use the full load of the bridge on that section. Okay, step one, sheet piles. The project was broken into 2 phases so that we could maintain that travel lane. This meant that half of new span 1 would be installed at a time. So to stabilize and hold back the embankment with both phases, a temporary sheet pile wall was driven approximately 3 feet to the west of those new piles. The decision was made to start with the north section of the bridge first for phase 1. Also note, these are pictures of phase 2 sheet pile wall. Don't be confused. So although difficult to foresee, the decision to start with the north half may have had us run into some issues later on in the project that I'll discuss in more detail. But in the end, we had to start somewhere. All right, so this was a pretty interesting discovery. Once the sheet pile wall was in place and the soil was executed for the new piles, doing so exposed the backside of the existing vent number 1. And these photos show the extent of the damage to the existing pile cap from the settling, which was unable to be reached by those mitigation efforts discussed previously. The damage was likely more severe than I think we anticipated, and reinforced any design decision to drive an entirely new bent in lieu of exploring possibilities of stabilizing or repairing the existing bent pile system. Contractor was nice enough to fill the cracks in this old pile cap with epoxy grout from the backside for us, just to help stabilize that and keep it in one piece as long as possible, so that we didn't have water going through there causing erosion that would have been a problem later on. Progressing through the project, next we had to install false work and pre-drill. So after excavation was complete, the false work was installed, and finally you can see the X marks the spot here on the false work, and then the goop coming up after the pre-drill was done. You may ask why we pre-drilled. So based on that, the age of the bridge and all the spalling we've experienced in the past, and the concern with vibration going through the structure maybe causing more settling, the choice was made to pre-drill to approximately 40 feet. The overarching engineering thought was this would reduce the risk for vibration to propagate into the structure itself, causing spalling or utilities to fail, going back to our rusted water lines. So the hope was it would mitigate those risks. So this brings us to the exciting part, which is the pile driving. Those following along, again, may notice this is phase 2, but the concept is the same. I'll say thank you to CEU Miami for lending me to their UAS program, for lending me their unmanned aerial system, aka a drone, to capture these images and document the construction process. So here we are, pile driving. Significant coordination was required between the Coast Guard and various stakeholders to get these 70-foot plus piles on site, unloaded, prepped, lifted, and driven into place. You can see this shared roadway is used by, you have the Fisher Island Community Association, namely the ferry terminal to the left there. You have the Florida Power and Light transmission area in the back. Miami Beach Police Department has the building with kind of the blue awnings there. And then there's other commercial entities in the area. So the real challenge was limiting our traffic interruptions to those folks, as well as allowing operations and transit on and off the base bridge to, continue and limit those interruptions. So in order to do that, we had to break the pile driving operation into a bunch of independent tasks. So we start here. This is kind of task 1. Traffic was interrupted while the delivery truck was brought in, rigged up, and the pile was removed from the truck. So at this point, traffic is stopped. We've rigged. We're about to lift. And this will take us to the next step, if I can get my slides right. So the next step is going to be rigging the pile. So once the pile's off the truck, we let all the traffic flow through, and then they prep the pile on the ground, get it rigged to lift, and then they commence the lifting operation, at which point we secure traffic again. And traffic remains secured as the pile is lifted, as you see it happening in this picture, and is moved into what we call pocket. That's where it was placed with the false work and secured in place. So once the pile was secured in place with the false work, we were able to allow traffic to clear again, which is pretty much the stage you see here. And the contractor would then rig the pile driving apparatus, what we call the cage, which is the one on the right. If you see on the deck, the one on the left is actually the pre-drilling rig. So here traffic is flowing. We're about to secure again as the cage is lifted. So once the cage is lifted, one lucky gentleman gets to go up in a man lift and secure the pin on the cage around the backside of the pile, and then the cage is slid down the pile while it is in the pocket. Once the cage is secured to the pile, then we are able, and the man lift gets out of the way, we're able to resume traffic and pile can be driven. So the pile gets driven, all great, and then we have to secure traffic again to get the cage off the pile and back to the side. So here you kind of see that final stage. This pile was successfully driven to a depth of 61 feet. Cage has been removed. We're about to free flow traffic for the rest of the afternoon. So the next step, once the piles are driven to depth, you got to have 2 of them for each side. So once the 2 piles are driven to depth, they are cut to height, and then the formwork and rebar are placed, followed by the cap being poured. There was a brief pause here to ensure that the concrete passed its 5-day strength before the old deck would be removed and the new deck would be installed. All right, so you see here you have old planks on the left, new planks on the right. The old planks had to be cut and then rigged to be removed. They would be lifted up out of place, obviously, with a crane. And then the most cost-effective way, the contractor just cut them up into smaller pieces and disposed of them, as opposed to trucking them in large pieces. The next step would be post-tensioning, and this proved fairly problematic for the phase 1 of the project. Okay, so those with a keen eye can kind of see on the right side where the red circle is. Those are the holes where the post-tensioning rod is supposed to go. And there's a box in the way. And you're probably going to ask, well, what's in the box? Well, the box has 13,000 volts of electricity that is the entire service connection for Base Miami Beach. So this immediately required us to coordinate with local power, Florida Power and Light, to have them come out, look at what was going on, and then come up with a plan together to, make this work. And what was eventually decided was FPL would come out, they would secure the power, the high voltage lines would be adjusted out of the way, we'd cut holes in the side of the box and run the rod through, and then put everything back the way it was and re-energize the power. So you see here in the next picture, we have FPL on site finally. Before they did this, obviously, power was secured. This was complicated by the fact that Base Miami Beach is serviced by 2 transformers, which are not exclusively ours. So there was a little bit of making sure they only shut power off to us and they don't shut the power off to our neighbors. So once that was all figured out and power was properly and safely turned off, we were able to pull those wires out of the way and bring in a concrete saw to cut a hole and run those posts through. So you see here the box, after it's all said and done, we patched it back up, and then we had to reattach all of that conduit back onto the outside. So no project comes without its challenges. This one certainly had its own. Just a little bit of interference from our service connection here. All right, this brings us to the next stage, which would be backfill and sheet pile removal. So once the post-tensioning was completed, they would have to backfill, compact, and remove the sheet pile. And then once that was done, paving was all that remained. Unsurprisingly, South Florida, trying to pave, it did not seem to matter whether it was a small patch or the whole bridge. The South Florida's tropical climate and propensity for rain, it always wanted to rain on days we wanted to pave. So that delayed things a little bit, but I guess that's part of the joy of being in South Florida. Okay, so this was an interesting part of the project when we were trying to switch from phase 1 to phase 2. We encountered a delay, and if I can do what Daniel showed me how to do over here and draw a little picture for you. If you look at this picture right here, you see some what looks like freshly disturbed soil, and you would be right. The Fisher Island Ferry Terminal construction happened to coincide with our need to do work on the south face. So the phase 2 work wasn't able to complete or commence until the Fisher Island Community Association completed their construction work right where the crane is sitting in this picture. So that disturbed earth is where a utility line was run. So the delay ran from mid-June until August 5th. Once the utility work was completed by Grycon, their contractor, our contractor remobilized the 70-ton crane you see in this picture and immediately commenced driving the temporary sheet pile wall. This is a good point to note, probably the major lesson learned I took away from this project, which was, when there's numerous real property hurdles, we had numerous real property hurdles we had to overcome to move forward with the project. Here, we saw the consequence that precipitated from leaving a construction, specifically the construction area in this case, subject to a third party's use and availability. They had priority and we had to wait. It would have been beneficial to start tackling this problem and reviewing it years, if not decades prior. I know many of this land kind of changed hands over the years, and there may have been an opportunity for the Coast Guard to secure some additional real property rights on that end of the bridge. So if you have a bridge that you're responsible for from a facilities perspective, it behooves you to investigate what property interests you have at the termination points of that bridge. It can dramatically complicate future construction or repair efforts. Additionally, in light of all this numerous competing land uses at the time of this project, a barge crane could have been considered. Although notably more expensive, the time saved in development and execution of the project may have adequately offset the increase in price. Although, depending on the barge type, if it needed to spud down based on the benthic survey we had, I don't know that that would have been feasible. Lastly, although the confluence of the two projects would have been very difficult to foresee, we had our own project schedule delays mixed in with Grycon's, I think, pretty significant project schedule delays. It was not foreseeable at the onset. But had we started working the south end of the bridge first, then the delay may have been avoided. Although you can see in the picture, there was some construction work on the north side as well. It may have interfered, but we may have had a better ability to work around it than we did with the south end. In the end, we worked through the delay, got it taken care of. Contracting issued a modification, and everyone was happy, and we moved forward just about 6 weeks later than we meant to. So this brings us to the execution of the modification, which was the water pipe replacement. So in order to replace our domestic water and sewer lines along the bridge, a temporary pipe run had to be laid. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so I guess my camera was freezing. I hope everyone can see me now. So in order to replace the domestic water and sewer piping alongside the bridge, a temporary pipe run had to be laid here along the deck and jumped into the existing system. That's easy when it's, the 3/4 inch line for your house. It's not so easy when it's the 12-inch PVC line for a entire base. Care was taken to ensure this area was coned off and obvious to drivers. Thankfully, during the short window of the install, we didn't have any negligent folks run over the lines, especially the wastewater, and especially considering South Florida drivers. But in hindsight, specifying that the contractor used some sand-filled barricades may have been prudent on our part. and would be something I would look to do in the future. I think we got lucky this time. The T connections are something we actually asked the contractor to leave in place, and we're just capped instead of removing and replacing with a straight line. This allows us should a maintenance need arise in the future, that we can pretty easily affect temporary connections to the bridge and reroute those lines. That being said, a little bit of additional maintenance for us now. We have an additional plate and a bunch of bolts we have to monitor for corrosion, but shouldn't be anything that some good core seal can't fix. Okay, moving into the water pipe replacement, you see in these pictures we have the new HDPE pipe, looking shiny and beautiful, not rusty, thank goodness. Replacing a potable water pipe run of this length was not without its challenges, and is certainly not something we routinely encounter in the facilities world, especially above ground piping like this. So I think there was significant discussion on the proper means and method to sanitize the new lines before placing them in service. Ultimately, we had to consult with Coast Guard's subject matter experts on this topic, the Health, Safety, and Work Life branch. They advised us on the applicable publications that we had to follow for these procedures, and it was settled that plug chlorination of the new pipe section would be required. Those that aren't familiar, what that means is you have it closed off, you have the new pipe that you're about to put into service. For us, it took 11 gallons. So they pour 11 gallons of bleach into that pipe section, and then they leave it isolated, but they charge it. And then they let that charged water with the 11 gallons sit in there for a specified amount of time. Once that's done, we have to get rid of this super chlorinated water somehow. Back up to we're on an island surrounded by endangered corals. So luckily, we were able to improvise a way to temporarily divert our fire main water into the sanitary sewer system to accomplish the flush. FPL, don't get alarmed. All of our water is billed based on the same. We don't have an independent fire department fire water connection like some folks do. So it was up to snuff there and allowed us to flush that water without causing any environmental impacts, which is what we were going for. So that brings us to the end state where Settlement has been arrested. Hooray. No signs of it rearing its ugly head yet, knocking on wood. That brings us to future outlook. Mission support product line, CEU Providence, if you're listening, here's where I'll stomp my foot. The most recent waterfront survey from 2019 indicates that the 36 concrete piles are softening throughout the water column. This concrete deterioration will begin to expose our reinforcing steel within potentially the next 5 to 10 years, and will precipitate a swift loss of structural integrity to our bridge and obvious load limiting. That will impact our ability to conduct operations, pretty much all operations. The only way to arrest this deterioration is going to be to encase all 36 concrete piles or replace the bridge in its entirety. In addition, we continue to experience concrete spalling, which you see a picture of on the bottom there, of the underside of the bridge decking as well as the pile caps. This was originally addressed in 2015, but the age of the bridge and all the repair and construction work that had been done to the bridge with the bent one replacement as well as other work and just general traffic, we continue to see it. It continues to spall, and with the age of the bridge, it's not going to go away. There are efforts currently being explored to recapitalize our bridge, and we certainly hope to encase these piles, CEU Providence. Let's see, moving on. I think I only have one more page here. I do want to say thank you to all the entities that came together during this project, especially Civil Engineering Unit Miami. At the time, it was Commander Kicklighter, now Captain J.D. Lentine, and Michael Lazinski. From Design, Rob Guzman and Enrique San, thank you. Contracting, Ada Hoggard and Odie McGee. I think you each had a modification, so congratulations. From construction, it was Commander John Lisco at the time. Lieutenant Meredith Puddington was the construction manager. Thank you for putting up with all my phone calls. Ron Holzinger carried over there for a little while, and Leon LaPearl was the on-site inspector who put up with all my questions. Real Property, who handled all those different entities, was Commander Oranius, specifically Paul Hewitt at the time. I think I saw his name on a lot of this stuff. And facility asset managers, Lieutenant Ava Gonzalez was involved then. I know Casey Crispino, if you're out there, you probably had a part in the water main additional funding, as well as Joe Johnson. Anderson Place Construction and your subs. Thank you to Steve Hall and Kelly Connerton. Fisher Island Community Associations, Gricon, Florida Power and Light, Miami Beach PD, Tetra Tech, all played a big part in getting to the end game here. And lastly, thank you to those folks at Coast Guard Miami Beach that were involved in this. Captain Harry Motti and my XO at the time, Commander Roger Omenheiser. Appreciate you putting up with me running in with my hair on fire with whatever unplanned closure we had or ridiculousness that came up. And then lastly, thank you to my facility engineering department for all of the additional work this meant for them. And specifically you, Joe Johnson, your ability to handle all of the closures, the notifications, and a lot of the logistics made my life a lot easier, and were certainly part of the successfulness of this project. So that is all I have. It looks like I'm right on time. I'll turn this over to Daniel for any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Commander Becker, for that great presentation. So just wanted to remind all of you who are listening, if you have any questions on the presentation, go ahead, put them up in the Q&A tab there, and we'll kind of be going through those and asking questions as they come through. So to get things started here, yeah, let's take this question that just came in from Glenn here about were the bidders pre-qualified for this project?
So off the cuff, I'm not 100% certain, but I do think I recall this was pushed through our Regional Multiple Award Contracting Mechanism, RMAC. So I think they were. I do think they were pre-qualified.
All right. So one question also that I had was when you were talking about Florida Power and Light and the discovery of the electrical cable in there. So how long was power shut down to the base, and how was that outage manned from an operational perspective?
So when we got the news that we had to shut off power to the whole base, it ended up, so we worked out the logistics. We were able to manage about a 4-hour outage, which we mitigated operationally via our installed generators. So base has a series of installed generators for resiliency, whether it be hurricane, commercial power goes out for another reason. But our two main buildings do have a installed system as well as a tertiary portable backup system that we use. So we went up on our onboard generators and then switched the breakers and made the go-ahead to have power secured. In the end, we were secured for the full 4 hours. Once FP&L's work and our cutting work was complete, we went back up. Some services were limited on base, obviously, but with enough notice, we were able to ensure that cutters and everyone else weren't inconvenienced, and we didn't shut power off while someone was in the middle of some critical operation.
All right. So this question is about kind of earlier on you were talking about some of the causes for the bridge settlement. So if you had documented bridge conditions prior to that adjacent vibratory sheet pile work, that could show that the work was the cause of settlement, would you have had basis for that entity to bear the cost of repair?
That's the $1,000,000 question, right? And ultimately, I think you'd have to go through legal claims and litigation for that. Was there enough evidence to show that it was specifically from a vibratory hammer, or was it because of our age and our own truck traffic? We would have needed probably a forensics engineer or some smoking gun that identified, yes, it was definitively the sheet pile work that caused that settlement, as opposed to any other laundry list of things that could have possibly resulted in that. Could there have been, a share of responsibility there? Sure, but that's ultimately a question for claims and lit.
All right. So I had another question here from the original article that you published in TME here, and it was about the phasing that you conducted in order to keep the single lane open on the bridge at all times. And you said that your major work items had to be coordinated so single lane would not be closed for more than 15 minutes. And you mentioned there was some other possibilities, or what other ways would you might have had to mitigate some of these closures, such as overtime or after hours or weekend work for the contracting?
Yeah. So although it would have been more expensive, and I think Coast Guard Civil Engineering is very budget conscious, had weekend and overtime work been authorized under the contract, we probably would have been able to shift a larger portion of the construction items to a off-peak period for base, which would have been more convenient for us. That being said, there is a prohibition on, there are some noise restrictions in the Miami Beach area that we had to comply with. So we were never going to get to an end state where we could have driven piles after dark. But sure, if we had an unlimited budget, shifting stuff to the weekend and for overtime would have been beneficial from an operational perspective.
Well, sure, of course. All right. So I have another question here, and like I said, feel free to keep questions coming. All other attendees in here, we'll still have some time afterwards. But I wanted to ask about permitting. Was any permitting needed for this project?
So I'm in the end users chair, but speaking for what I know about on the environmental side of the house, I think several waivers were sought by or through numerous entities. Army Corps of Engineers provided a waiver on the project. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection provided a waiver for aspects of the project. In addition, there was a CADEX that we were operating under at the time. I do think the one stickler was we knew that if we were going to disturb corals or do work in water, the permitting requirements were going to increase. So because the piles were not driven in water, there was a lower permitting threshold that was needed, and we were able to proceed with kind of a lower bar there.
All right. And another question that's just come in. What was the total project cost for this?
So I think we were roughly $2 million at award, and then by the time we were done with modifications and everything, the project ended up being approximately $2.8 million total installed construction cost. And that includes the water lines, which were not cheap. That's a difficult job to do.
All right.
I see a very Coast Guard specific issue. No PRV issues. Was this AFC 43 funded? So speaking to the PRV issues, I do know that a PRV recalc I wasn't going to go into all that because I didn't know how many Coast Guard entities were going to be on here and really understand that jargon. But yes, a PRV recalc was required in order to kind of meet our, I guess I won't call it audit, but accounting rules that we have in order to make the project executable, is what I would call it. And then it was AFC 43 funded. This was not a Massey or I don't even think it got PCNI.
All right, thank you. Thanks for fielding that one. I was
No problem.
I said, I think that one is a little bit above me. And it looks like we got one more question that just came in about NEPA documentation. What type of NEPA documentation was required, CADX, EA?
Yeah, I will not pretend to be a absolute ninja when it comes to understanding the NEPA process. But I will say I know that obviously it was put in DSS and a DSS was completed, and then there was a CADX that it was operated under for at least a portion of the project. I think the way or an environmental impact statement was avoided was because we were doing land-based work instead of in the water. But I will defer anything along those lines to the environmental professionals on this. Welcome.
All right. Looks like that's about it. So I wanted to remind everybody as you are heading out, you can grab under the handouts tab if you want to grab a copy of the slide deck as well as your PDH certificate. These will also be getting emailed out to all of the attendees as well, but you can grab them here before you go. So I wanted to say thank you, Lieutenant Commander Becker. Thank you for your great presentation, for fielding our questions. And thank you to all of the attendees who took some time to tune in today. And if you are interested in submitting an article to the military engineer and possibly getting invited to present one of these deeper insights into your article, please visit our website for our editorial calendar and our writer's guidelines. We've got some upcoming issues listed here. We're currently accepting proposals for our March-April, which is our energy issue again, and our May-June, which will focus again on project delivery. And then feel free to take a look at as well as some of the other upcoming webinars from SME National and our communities of interest. You can definitely see the full calendar on our website, on our national calendar from there. So on behalf of SAME, the military engineer, and our featured presenter, thank you all for joining us today, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for attending.